Bonnie told me, hey, when she saw Kyle telling us numbers, she said, Dad, go up there and do 71. So, no, we're not going to sing number 71, but it was a good one. She picked Blessed Assurance. That's a great song for not knowing what that number would even mean. Tonight, so we pivoted, we meaning me, pivoted in the middle of preparation for the lesson tonight. So this is actually going to be a part one. We're doing part one of You Can't Please Anyone. When you look at Jesus and his life, you notice that he ends up being ridiculed by everybody. Like no one ends up completely on Jesus' side throughout his ministry. Even his own followers, his disciples, get on to him for stuff, right? Like, saying he's going to die. Don't say that, right? When he interacts with certain people, it makes other people angry. When he interacts with those people, it makes these people feel judged. And so, as Jesus goes throughout his life and the stories that we read about him, we notice, he really can't win for losing. I don't remember the exact verse. I probably should have written it down, but I have other stuff that I wanted to get to. He says, listen, when John the Baptist came and he lived in the wilderness and, did all the things that crazy John did, you said he had a demon. Then I show up, the Son of Man, he calls himself. When the Son of Man came eating and drinking, you called him a glutton and a drunkard. Really, there wasn't any winning. You can't please everyone. In Jesus' case, you almost couldn't please anyone. Really, that was a way of beginning to look at how Jesus interacted with the religious and the pagans. One of the themes that from our summer series, The Divine Dichotomies, that I really liked that no one picked was that Jesus was too religious for pagans and he was too pagan for the religious. Like he really was. When religious people looked at Jesus, they couldn't believe the things that he did. They were astounded that he would act and associate the way that he did. And when the pagans looked at Jesus, what did they see? Another one of those crazy Jews, right? Who eats weird food and has bizarre laws and sleeps in a tent for a week once a year with everyone else. Like, Jesus he really was. He was too religious for pagans and he was too pagan for religious people. And he couldn't really come to please anyone or everyone in anything that he did. But as I was looking at it, I realized there's a lot here that we can learn from, and these are really at least two lessons, right? Too religious for the pagans and too pagan for the religious. So we're going to start tonight with part one, talking about how Jesus was a little too religious for the pagans. Like I said at the outset, Jesus was a Jew. The Jews were already funny people, right? They were the only exception in the Roman Empire to be allowed to worship their own deities. They were these strange people who got very tied up in arms over their God and over their rules, and more specifically, over their holidays and over their temple and over their religion. Everyone thought the Jews were strange because they were strange. They were God's people, and they were a little bit strange. Jesus, before he was even born, had these prophecies made about him. And as a result, he was too religious as an unborn child for King Herod. Before Jesus even shows up, King Herod says, we need to kill this guy before he gets here. So he sends out a decree to kill all children that could even kind of be his age, 2 years old and under. In John chapter 6, when you look at Jesus' teachings, John 6, he's teaching about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. And when we studied this, I said, as I think is the truth, he does absolutely nothing to diffuse the weirdness of that statement, right? He makes a statement, if you guys want to abide in me, you have to eat me. Well, what do you mean by, not actually? Drink my blood. He doubles down. And it says, you want to flip over to John chapter 6 and look at how the people responded, right? In verse 60 of John chapter 6, it says, when many of his disciples heard it, they said, this is a hard saying. Who can listen to it? Right? They turned away. They ended up leaving him. This is weird, right? I get it. We're Jews. We're all about, symbolism and ritual and the law. But that is too much for us. And so several people turned away. After Jesus died, was raised, and established the church, and after Acts chapter 2, and the Christians started doing their stuff, Romans thought early Christians were some of the strangest things they've ever seen. They would ask them things like, where is your temple? Where do you guys worship? And they would say, well, Jesus was our temple, and we're kind of the temple now, all of us together. That's weird. Okay, what do you sacrifice in your religion? Jesus was our sacrifice. He only had to do it once, like we talked about in class this morning. Okay, all right. So that's weird. Who are your priests? Who does all this stuff for you? Well, believe it or not, Jesus was our priest, and we get to be part of his priesthood. All of us, every single one of us. That was so weird. It was so strange that the Romans actually called them atheists, because what they did looked nothing like religion of the pagans. That wasn't the worst thing the Romans called early Christians. You remember that thing Jesus said about eating his flesh and drinking his blood? Well, early Christians were also called cannibals, because they did this weird thing when they met together where they ate the flesh and drank the blood of their leader, Jesus. Worse than that, they called each other brother and sister, and so the Romans would call them incestuous cannibals. I cannot personally think of many things worse than being called an incestuous cannibal. It's a little uncomfortable to even say. This is who Jesus' followers were, and they were very off-putting. Jesus and his followers were very off-putting to pagans. He was way too religious. He was a weird religious guy in the eyes of the pagans. But we are supposed to be like Jesus, right? So I guess that means we should be too religious for pagans too, right? Well, what does that even mean? Maybe if we use our terms, it would make a little more sense. We need to be too Christian for the world. That makes a little more sense. We need to stand out the way that Jesus and his followers stood out. We need to be too Christian to be categorized as a part of the world. I think that makes sense. The only problem with that is, what does that look like? Well, what do people usually mean when you say that statement? I'll tell you how it's been presented to me in the past. And maybe this isn't what you've always heard, but it's what I've always been taught. Usually it means that we need to not do the things that the world does. Right? Sure. Amen that. But we're about to go a little deeper than that. I remember in middle school, we had a teacher, and he was telling a story about his wife, who was a high school teacher, and they were in what do you call it, where the teachers go and the kids can't? The teacher workroom, the break room, something like that, right? Teacher's lounge. That's what I knew. It sounded cooler than workroom. Yeah, the teacher's lounge. They get to hang out in there. All right, so they were in the teacher's lounge, and all the teachers were hanging out, and they were talking, and they were having a good time, and they were laughing, joking around and stuff. And this teacher was telling me that his wife sat there with a frown on her face. And when they asked, what's something wrong? What's going on? Her response was, I do not think jokes like that are funny. Now, let me tell you, I understand the sentiment of the lesson he was teaching us, that Christians shouldn't engage in some things that the world engage in. I get the point. No one has ever missed me with an example more. All I thought as I think at the time, an 8th grader, wasn't she so high and mighty? She lost all credibility with me in that moment. I wouldn't do that. That just seems mean. Listen, there's a way to lovingly say, I don't do those kind of things. There's a way to not judgmentally say, well, listen, that's not, I'm glad you guys are having fun, but that's not how I choose to do it, Or quietly excuse yourself from the room. There's no sense in frowning in the middle of happy people. I don't want to be the frowner. I want to be the happy people. And so that typically, we don't do those things, is the attitude of being too Christian for the world. It comes across as judgmental. You think of the prayer that the Pharisee prays. Thank God I am not a sinner like them. Too Christian for the world. You think of the older brother in the parable of the two lost brothers, also known as the prodigal son, and how he looked and his measuring stick became his brother, right? I don't have to outrun a bear, I just have to outrun my friend. His measuring stick became, well, I've never done those things. I'm better than that. when we think being too Christian for the world, we typically think in these kind of ideas, right? It's always framed in we don't do the things that people of the world do. And I'm not trying to say that that is not a true statement. I believe Juan's amen was sincere, and I agree with it, all right? But there's a spirit of it that can go very wrong very fast, and I think it most of the time does. At least very often it does. And so we think about being too Christian for the world. Well, typically that's very off-putting. When someone is judgmental or self-righteous or an older brother or pharisaical, those are the things they get called. And it's not very engaging. People don't typically look at you and go, man, what do you have that I don't have? I need some of that. Usually they look at you and go, I don't want any part of what you've got. And so there's something different about what Jesus did, right? His too Christian for the world looked different than, well, I just don't do the things that the world does. There was something about it that was unique. It was engaging. It was attractive to outsiders. Think about what it really means to look too Christian for the world. It means that you look too much like God for people to call you normal. Instead of saying, I don't, it means I do. There are things that Christians ought to do that show the character of God that make them stand out. Because that's not how the world acts, right? This is not a restrictive side of Christianity, but a liberating one. Christians who are too Christian for the world should look too much like God to be called normal. There's something weird about you. I don't know exactly what it is. But what it is Christians ought to look too much like God. They should exhibit the character of God in their day-to-day life. So, I don't know if this has ever happened in the history of preaching, but you guys are about to have 14 points counting this morning, all right? So Dad had 7, and I've got 7 things I think are really impactful ways that we can be too Christian for the world, that we can be too religious for the pagans, that we can look like God in our day-to-day life. We're going to go through 7 of them, and then we'll wrap up. The first thing, and we've talked about this recently, is why I put it first, is being overwhelmingly generous. When you read about God in the Bible, he is a God who loves to give good things to his children, right? I mean, that's what Jesus says about him in the Sermon on the Mount. If your Father who loves you knows, if your fathers who are of the flesh know how to give you good gifts, how much more than God? How much more will God know how to give you good things if you ask for them? Right? You think about what Jesus says when he says, if anyone wants to sue you and take your tunic, what does he tell you to let him do? Let him have your cloak as well. Right? Matthew chapter 5 and verse 40. If anybody wants your shirt, give them your undershirt. If anybody wants your jacket, give him your shirt too. I mean, listen, don't give to people as they want from you. No, like overwhelmingly. We talked about Abraham, which is an excellent example of this. Abraham and his wife Sarah in the Genesis chapter, I lost it. Is it 18? 14. I think it's Genesis chapter 14, where the men come to their house. And they don't know who these men are, but for some reason, Abraham decides to invite them into his home. And then he runs screaming into his tent and tells his wife, hey, make 70 pounds of flour and knead it into cakes. I'm going to go kill a cow, and we're feeding these guys. How many people are out there, Abraham? 3. What? I mean, you remember the story. This is just ridiculous generosity that Abraham shows. When Jesus describes the kingdom of heaven, he references this story as the kind of generosity Christians are going to have. If we're going to be too Christian for the world, we're not going to worry about ours and it's mine, and we're not going to be possessive of our things. We're going to be overwhelmingly generous. You think about the early church. In Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 5, we get a little peek into what it was like in the early church, right at the beginning days of the establishment of the church. It says that they pooled their possessions together so that no one among them had need. And if anyone had a need, it was met. Someone would sell their possessions and give to those who had need. Just overwhelming generosity. If we're going to be too Christian for the world, if we're going to stand out because we act too much like God, we're going to be people who are ridiculously generous. I heard a guy who taught about tipping at restaurants. It was actually, Kathy Neighbor sent me a podcast from this guy, and this was one of his soapboxes. He said, listen, if you go into any restaurant and you ask the staff what their favorite day to work is and what their least favorite day is, the favorite will vary. Their least favorite is Sunday afternoons because the church crowd comes in and they are more rude and they tip worse. What a horrible reputation to have. He you want to hear it, I'll send it to you because he got on a high horse. And it was appropriate. I mean, he said a lot of truth, but I'm not going to recount his whole argument. But isn't that a terrible reputation to have? As Christians, if we're going to stand out from the world, our generosity of our God should be shown through our life. Maybe we should double or triple our tips. Maybe we should pay for 2 meals. I don't know how that's going to look. Maybe we should make an order, say it was wrong, and say, I was just kidding. You want some food? Yeah, I don't know what it looks like. But listen, like as Christians, there should not be a reputation among us that we're stingy and that we're only worried about ourselves and that we're rude. People's favorite day to work should be Sundays when Christians show up because they are overwhelmingly generous just like their God. If we're going to be too Christian for the world, we got to be overwhelmingly generous. Secondly, we need to be relentlessly kind. Relentlessly kind. If we're going to be too Christian for the world, we need to exhibit kindness in a way that is nonstop. Like in a way that is confusing. Why are you still being kind to that guy? He is a jerk, right? Why are you still showing kindness when they've treated you so poorly? That's the kind of things Christians should have a reputation for. Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 1 says that a soft answer, a kind answer, some versions will say, turn away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Well, Jesus said we should be peacemakers, right? So harsh words it is, and fights. That's the reputation of Christians, right? Oh, Christians ought to be known for their unrelenting kindness. You are always kind. It's like your default setting is to be kind to people. I can't help but think, because it's that time of year, of Buddy the Elf. And this won't be the last time. There's a guy, a preacher I know, his name is Taft, and he sends out a tweet. Well, I don't know if he does it anymore. I haven't been on Twitter in forever. But back in the day when I was in high school, he'd send out a tweet right around this time of year, every year. And he said, if more people played the game like Buddy the Elf, we'd have less divorce in America. And I was like, man, I mean, you can't lie about it. Buddy the Elf is kind of a great guy. But listen, if you go watch that movie, he is mistreating repeatedly. And all he does is give gifts and sing songs and smile at people and say, I just wanted to meet you, right? He is relentlessly kind when he's interacting with people. If we're going to be Christians, we got to find a way to show kindness. Kindness is one of the fruit of the Spirit. If the Spirit is in our life, then kindness should be the overflow of how we interact with those around us. We shouldn't answer someone who's angry with anger. We should, like the proverb says, give a kind answer or a gentle answer or a soft answer to turn away wrath, being peacemakers, because we're too Christian for the world. We are abnormally, relentlessly kind. Number 3, we are irrationally patient. How many people do you know who are irrationally patient? Not irrationally impatient, because I know a lot of those people. I know them very intimately, personally, if you will. Listen, it's easy. Like the default setting in America is to be impatient. Someone's going too slow in front of you. Your order is taking too long. The other day, we went to Chicken Express, and there was a guy who was in there. And it was one of the most, it was not a bad thing. I was talking to the Chick-fil-A crew over here, and they were like, oh, that's nothing when I told them about it. It was unsettling for me, all right? He was standing there, and he was like, listen, it's been 22 minutes, and where's my chicken? I've got to go. All right. Hey, it's been 23 minutes, and I need you to put the money back on my card. I mean, he was just belligerent, and it was awful. And then he called back after he didn't get something that he definitely got and said, you need to fire the girl that works up front. And it was just like why, right? If you are in such a hurry that you couldn't spare 23 minutes to wait on some fast food, which anyone who cooks knows 23 minutes is pretty quick. That's like you make a whole meal in 23 minutes, you're doing pretty well. So if you can't spare 23 minutes to come get some food, stay home. order a pizza or something. Like, you didn't have to come here, man. That's like our default setting is to be impatient. Things take too long. I've got somewhere to be. I've got things to do. I don't have time for this. I mean, that is an anthem of America right now. And yet Christians, if we're going to be too Christian for the world, if we're going to look different, we need to be the opposite, irrationally patient. We referenced in church this morning, we're talking about God's patience. You think about how many times God's people went away from him. I mean, we're talking hundreds of years of patience. Israel was a nation for I think it was 320-something years before God finally said, you guys, I'm done. Assyria's coming in and they're taking over. Right? Like 320-something years of, well, we know what you said, but we lost the law. We're not keeping that anymore. We've adopted these other idols. We're worshiping things that are not you, and we're breaking pretty much all of your 10 commandments. The Sabbath, what's that? Right? These are the people that God dealt with, and he was patient for over 300 years with this nation of people. You back up a little bit and you think about the Judges. You know the Judges is the same story over and over and over again? Here's how it goes. The people are in peril. They cry out to God. He sends a judge to deliver them. Once they're delivered, they decide idols weren't so bad. They start worshiping idols. The people end up being in peril because God sends a nation to capture. Why can't I think of a better word for capture? A nation to come capture them. Then they're enslaved. They cry out to God. God sends a judge. The judge defeats them. They're free. Then they worship the idols again. It happens 8 or 9 times in a book. In a book. And they're still God's people. It's irrational patience. I remember there was a lady at a Mavs game one time. I was going to get food. And my blood sugar was very, very low. All right? Low, past hungry. I'm sorry, past hangry. You know what I'm talking about? Where it's I'm not alive, all right? I'm here, but my eyes are only going to open about halfway. I don't think I could speak loud enough for you to hear. I kind of just want to lay down, All right, I was that kind of hungry. And she said, I ordered some meal during a break, and she said, oh, brother, you're going to have the patience of Job if you want those chicken fingers. And I was like, that's fine. No, don't worry about it. I'll wait. I was just real gentle. I mean, I was dead inside. I was so hungry. And she, it stopped her in her tracks, all right? She goes, oh, okay. I got my food first. She literally left her post with a line of 15 people, went to the back, made my meal, and gave it to me. Thank you for being so patient, right? I was barely patient. Honestly, it wasn't even a virtue. I was just tired, I was just okay with waiting because I didn't have the energy to do anything else about it. But listen, patience is something that is so countercultural. If we're going to stand out from the world, if we're going to be too Christian for the world and they're going to notice, listen, we have to be irrationally patient. It'll stand out in a big way. Number 4, we need to be constantly joyful. I mean, you guys all have the verse for this one, right? Philippians 4 and verse 4, what does Paul tell them? Rejoice in the Lord when it feels good. Rejoice in the Lord when things are going your way. Rejoice in the Lord always. In fact, I'm going to say it twice. Rejoice. Christians ought to be people who are constantly joyful. I'm going to be honest, I couldn't think of a better example, so I came up with Buddy the Elf again. But listen, is there a more joyful person in the world? I'm just saying, I know it's a silly movie, but honestly, there are things that he embodies that look pretty Christ-like. He is compassionate. He is caring about other people. He builds toys like a madman. I don't know if that's Christ-like, but he was a carpenter. Just throwing it out there. Listen, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Christians should be constantly joyful. Not joyful when things are going well. Not joyful when things are all turning up the right way. Christians ought to find a way to be joyful in spite of. You remember, if you've studied Philippians, that Paul was writing this letter to this church from where? The depths of prison. I mean, if ever there was a time to be a bit bitter, it would be in shackles, right? If ever there was a time to be frustrated, it would be a missionary who's grounded. He can't go anywhere, and yet he's supposed to be this great missionary. I got to get out there. Frustration could set in, and yet he has He has the presence of mind. He has the Christ-likeness to pen the words, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I'll say it, rejoice. A couple verses later, he says, I've learned to be content in all things, whether high or low. I can do anything through Christ who gives me strength. It doesn't matter where you're at. If you're a Christian, you should be exhibiting consistent joy. This is something that stands out. It is something that people notice, and if we're going to be too Christian for the world, we need to be constantly joyful. Number 1, overwhelmingly generous. Number 2, relentlessly kind. Number 3, irrationally patient. Number 4, constantly joyful. And number 5, we need to be actively empathetic. If we're going to be too Christian for the world, we need to be people who are actively empathetic. There is I don't know what it's called. I'm sure someone has some smart name for it. But there is a thing that we do in our culture where we hear bad news or see bad things on the internet and we go, oh, and that's like all we do about it. Or, oh, man, let me change my profile picture, right? Like we see stuff that is not right in the world and we're hurt by it, or we see something that someone is hurting and we're like, I see it, and it's like where we stop. Somehow socially that's become an acceptable amount of empathy for people. It's to just read about it and feel it, and you get to feel it, and they may or may not know you feel it, and then that's it. That's the end of it. Christians should stand out with this. Romans chapter 12 and verse 15, Paul writes to the Christians, he says, to rejoice with those who rejoice and to weep with those who weep. I mean, you could just say feel with those who feel, This is the idea as Christians. There's not a passive empathy. I'm not just sad because you're sad. I am with you, weeping with those who are weeping. I am with you. You're happy? Man, let me come celebrate with you. You think about the story of I'm going to try not to say the prodigal son, but the 2 lost sons. When the son comes home, the older brother is expected to do what when his father throws a feast? Come feast, celebrate. Listen, you may not be happy, but I am. My son came home. All right, listen, when the father throws a feast, he brings everyone from around. He gathers the town together and throws a celebration. Christians ought to be people who are willing to go celebrate with those who are celebrating. Rejoice with those who rejoice. And weep with those who weep. This is not a passive empathy. It's not a off in a distance, hey, I'm sorry that you're going through that. It's let's go do something to get your mind off of it. It's maybe you don't want your mind off of it. Can I just come over and sit with you for a little while? It's you're excited? Let's go celebrate. Let's go do something about this. It's you're having a difficult time? Well, let me come help you with whatever it is you're dealing with. It's you're sick and need someone to cook for you? Let me cook for you. I'm not the best, but it's edible, I think. Listen, Christians ought to be demonstrating active empathy. And you think about this in terms of exhibiting the characteristics of our God. We're studying Hebrews. What does Hebrews say about our high priest? It says, we don't have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect was tempted just like we are, but without sin. Right? God came from heaven to earth to be with us, right? To experience what we experience. He didn't have to do that. I mean, he is an all-knowing God. He could have just said, yes, I know, guys. But he didn't. He didn't stay at a distance. Like Chandler mentioned, the Word became flesh and lived among us. God dwelt among us. He was not passively empathetic. He was actively empathetic. And if we're going to be too Christian for the world, we've got to be actively empathetic just the same way. Number 6, we need to be recklessly forgiving. If we're going to be too Christian for the world, we need to be recklessly forgiving. Forgiving to the point of confusion, right? Why are you forgiving that guy again? He's just going to do it again. When in Matthew chapter 18, Peter comes to Jesus. I don't know what Peter's motivation was behind this. It's possible that he was thinking, this is a ridiculous amount. Maybe I'm going to show my virtue. It's possible he was just wondering what the answer to the question is and thought, I'm going to shoot high and see what Jesus says about this. He comes to Jesus and he says, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Seems like a lot. I mean, just you go through your mind and live that out for a minute. That's once a day. Let's just say you and a coworker have an agreement that they're going to pick you up for work and they're going to take you to work, right? And it's important that you're there on time. And so you talk about it the night before and the coworker says, hey, no worries, I'm going to be there. Your shift isn't this morning. You're still going to be there? Yes, I'm going to be there. I got you, man. No problem. 8 o'clock rolls around. 9 o'clock rolls around. Coworker doesn't show up. You call him. Hey, man, you said you were going to pick me up. Are you still coming? Is everything okay? Oh, dude, I overslept. I'm so sorry. Man, don't worry. Okay, I'm coming right now. They come, they pick you up. You're late. You get in trouble. Tuesday happens. Same plan. Same thing. 8 o'clock rolls around. 9 o'clock rolls around. You call them. They say, you are not going to believe this. I was up so late last night. I just didn't even hear my alarm. It's no problem, man. Just hurry up. I need to get to work. Wednesday happens. Listen, how many times are you going to call them for a ride? I don't think Jesus is saying you need to call these people and rely on them. That's not necessarily the message. But I'd be pretty ticked after 1 time. All right? I'd be really frustrated after 2 times. And I think I might just sever ties after 3. You know what I'm saying? 3 strikes and you're out. That's kind of our way of thinking in our world. Peter says, what if somebody does that to you 7 times in a row? That's ridiculous, right, Jesus? And his response is, no. You forgive someone up to 70 times 7 or 77 times, depending on how it's translated. Either way, at least 10 times that, Peter. At least. That's reckless. That's reckless. Someone's going to hurt you 7 times. I'm protecting myself for the most part. But as Christians who are going to be too Christian to be like the world, we got to exhibit the character of our God. What does God say about himself? He said he is abounding in loving kindness and forgiving to thousands. He demonstrates it over the past, entire history of the earth, that he's a God who's willing to forgive and forgive and forgive again and forgive a few more times. And yeah, you slipped up again, I'll forgive it again and forgive some more and forgive again. There's no end to our God's forgiveness when we're trying to please him. There shouldn't be an end to our forgiveness if we're going to be too Christian for the world like Jesus was. Number 7. We need to be dependably helpful. Dependably helpful. Couldn't think of a better word for that one. But dependably helpful. Listen, Matthew chapter 20 and verse 28, we reference this all the time. Jesus is speaking. He says, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. When Jesus showed up, he showed up with work gloves on, right? Jesus showed up with a towel around his waist ready to wash some feet. When Jesus came to earth, he didn't come here because it was a nice vacation spot. He didn't come here because it was going to be just so much fun. He showed up because he had a job to do. We sing the song that he could have called 10,000 angels, right? What would have happened if he did? What would have happened if Jesus on the cross said, absolutely not, I don't want to do this. I told you that last night like 3 times, all night long, was sweating blood. I'm just going to call the angels in right now because this is too hard. No, Jesus came to serve, and he came to give his life, and you could count on him. You could count on him. He was dependable. Not only was he a servant, but he was someone you knew, no questions asked, Jesus was going to do what he said he was going to do. He was dependable. Listen, he was always there if you needed him. Currently, right now, Jesus is always there when we need him. His sacrifice, like we said, it was once and for all, and we can take advantage of it at any time because he did what he said he was going to do. You know people like this, right? You know people like this who I know if I need something, I can call them and they'll be there. You know someone that comes to my mind? Juan, if you're moving. He's going to show up with his dolly and his knee braces, and he's going to come help you move. You know who I think of this morning? Dad asked Dan, he said, because we're going to be gone next week, he said, hey, Dan, I know it's a little short notice. Do you mind teaching Bible class next week for Joseph? Because, we're going to be out and I got everything else covered. I knew what Dan was going to say. You all know what Dan said. Unless he was going to be out of town, the answer was, sure, of course. You know people like this. Hey, listen, last minute I got called up. I need help doing XYZ. I need someone to watch my kids. I need someone to help with my car. I'm on the side of the road. Can you come get me? Growing up, I don't know that my parents are directionally challenged. I don't think they are. I think they're pretty good with directions. But we got lost every now and then. You know who was on the phone real quick? Frank Bender, man. That guy has a mental map better than MapQuest, like we talked about this morning. Listen, without fail, he could be in Chicago, and Mom and Dad would call him from some remote part of the city of Dallas. They'd be like, Frank, we see this and this and this street, and we're over by this thing. And he'd say, oh, yeah, you're just going to need to go up here. Probably take 2 streets. You'll go left, and then you'll see this thing, and then you'll be right on the highway. It was just like nothing fazed Frank. He was about as reliable as they came when you needed some directions, all right? I heard Lindsay inherited that, which was really exciting. Anyway, listen, as Christians, we've got to be dependably helpful. We got to be servants like our Lord, and we've got to be dependable. We can't be the kind of people who say, man, of course I'll do that, and then forget about it. We can't be the kind of people who say, oh, yeah, fine, I'll come help. We got to be people who are servants and are dependable, because that's who our Lord was. If we're going to be too Christian for the world like Jesus, we've got to be, number 1, overwhelmingly generous. Number 2, relentlessly kind. Number 3, irrationally patient. Number 4, constantly joyful. Number 5, actively empathetic. Number 6, recklessly forgiving. Number 7, dependably helpful. Just think of the impact that living like this would have on your life. I mean, it would radically change my day today. It would change it for the better. When Jesus says that he came so that you will have life and have it more abundantly in John 10, I think this is what he's talking about. You live like me, you're going to have a better life. Think also about how this impacted the people around Jesus. We say too Christian for the world, and typically the way we think of that, like we said in the beginning, is, the I don'ts and a little bit of a judgmental attitude. It's very off-putting to people, right? Was Jesus' version of too Christian for the world off-putting? The exact opposite. In Luke chapter 15, right before he tells the parable about the lost sheep and the lost coin and the 2 lost sons, it says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him. The tense of the verb drawing is a present and continuous. Like people, they weren't just doing this time. They were doing it all the time. The tax collectors and sinners, the worldly people in the Bible, were flocking to him. They were drawing near to him constantly. He couldn't go anywhere without these people. This kind of lifestyle, being too Christian to be a part of the world, too Christian for the world, the way that Jesus did it, by being like God, was intriguing to people. It was attractive to people. It was engaging for people. People saw that and they said, man, that's different. What does he have that I don't have in my life? Why is he kind when people are mean to him? Why is he so generous? He has nothing. There's a line in a song in a movie that says, when all you have is nothing, there's a lot to go around. Right? I love that line. Why is this guy so forgiving of people? Like, they're taking advantage of him, aren't they? The way that Jesus lived as too Christian for the world was one of the most attractive things about his life. I believe if he never did a miracle, this alone was enough to draw people to him, because this is who he is. He illustrated the character of God every day in the way that he lived. The point of the lesson tonight, I'm sure you'll be surprised, be like Jesus. Be like Jesus. Be too Christian for the world. Not because you don't do the things the world does. Sure, that's a part of it. But because you do the things that God does. You look too much like God for people to say you're a part of this world. And you will be weird. You'll be strange. You're going to stand out. But people will be dying to know what you know. People will be dying to know who you know. And it'll open doors like you wouldn't believe. The challenge tonight is be like Jesus. Be too Christian for the world. Illustrate, be an example of the character of our God in the world, and change the world the way that Jesus did by being too Christian for the world, too pagan, or don't be too pagan, too religious for the pagans, just like Jesus was when he was here on this earth. This is a challenge that is always set before us. It is ours from today, from the day we become Christians and wear his name, to the day that we die, to be more like Christ.